with examples of seeing His direct wrath. For example, from the sentencing that was passed on to Adam and Eve to a worldwide flood in chapter 6 of Genesis, from fire and brimstone, that Sodom in Genesis 18 and 19, from all the way to the Babylonian captivity. All this displays this kind of intervention. And of course, people today ask all the time with horrific events, is this the wrath of God? Well, the most graphic revelation of God's wrath and hatred against sin was when He poured out divine judgment on His Son on the cross. That's where we really see it. Now, God has various kinds of wrath. Let me just give you 5 of them. First of all, there's eternal wrath. Eternal wrath is what? Is hell, right? Then there's eschatological wrath, and that is the final day of the Lord. You remember in some of our studies in the past, we've looked at the day of the Lord, and we see that that is a day of judgment. Revelation 8 talks about that. 1 Thessalonians 5 talks about that. This is a coming day of judgment. And then there's cataclysmic wrath. It's like the flood or like the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then we have consequential wrath, and that's the principle of sowing and reaping. You remember in Galatians 5, he says, if you sow to the flesh, you will of the flesh reap corruption. And if you sow to the Spirit, you will reap life. And then there's the wrath of abandonment. The wrath of abandonment is where God removes His restraint and He lets people go into their sin. Now that's what you have right here. That's what you have in verse 18 all the way down to verse 32. You have this kind of wrath, the wrath of abandonment. God abandons the wicked continually throughout history to pursue their sin and its consequences. Look back at verse 18. Notice what he says here, that His wrath, God's wrath, is against men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. He says there in verse 18 that it's against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Well, it's like I said, God's wrath is not like that of a madman who strikes out indiscriminately, not caring who is injured or who is killed, like the guy that runs in with full anger and just opens up shooting everybody. Doesn't care who he hits. God's not like that. And nor is it like the sin-tainted anger of a person who seeks to be avenged of a wrong that's done to him. God's wrath is reserved for and justly directed at sin. Now, look again at verse 18, and there are 2 words that he uses here. He says that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness. That's one, ungodliness. And unrighteousness. You say, well, what is all of that? Well, first of all, let's say this. Ungodliness and unrighteousness, as he's using them here, are synonyms. All ungodliness is also unrighteousness, and all unrighteousness is also all ungodliness. It's a synonym. Same thing. He's saying that unrighteousness results from ungodliness, and it's the product of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Now, this whole idea of ungodliness, it refers to a lack of reverence for or a lack of devotion to. That is, a lack of worship of the true God. It's a defective relationship with God. And then unrighteousness refers to the result. It's what happens when you are ungodly. Basically, a lack of conformity in thought, word, and deed to the character and the law of God. So the point of what Paul is saying is you cannot have one without the other. When Paul speaks of ungodliness and unrighteousness here in verse 18, he's referring to 2 distinct things taken together to point to just one thing. God's angry, God is furious with a particular sin, and when you examine that sin, you see it to be both ungodly or irreverent, you see it to be unrighteous or immoral. Sin is the only thing that God hates. He does not hate poor people. He doesn't hate rich people. He doesn't hate dumb people or smart people. He doesn't hate untalented people or highly skilled people. He only hates the sin that those people and all others naturally practice. And of course, that inevitably brings His wrath. He says there that this wrath is revealed from heaven It's against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth and unrighteousness. You say, well, what does it mean to suppress the truth? Well, it's the idea to hold down. It's not, the King James says to hold, but you need to add another word to it to get the full meaning. It means to hold down. It means to prevent the truth from exerting its power in your heart or in your life. You're pushing it back. And see, the truth is not merely quiet, is it? The truth is not something that really successfully that we can push back. It's going to do its work. But men do that. They hold it down while they go on in their immorality. They seek to exert their sinfulness. And he says here that this is what brings about the wrath of God. Every person is naturally inclined to follow sin and resist God. That's the natural part of every person. That's the sinful nature that is in every person, to suppress the truth, to hold it back, to push it away. And of course, it's only through divine intervention, through the new birth that is produced by the gospel, that a person would welcome the truth and not suppress it. But there is still that tendency, even as a Christian, to kind of push away from the truth when you're in sin. Essentially, that is what we're doing. That phrase, it could be rendered this way, that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all who are constantly attempting to suppress the truth by steadfastly holding on to their sin. See, it's so much part of their life, so much part of their nature, that every person has a built-in, natural, compelling desire to suppress and oppose God's truth. It's built in. So the single sin that provokes the wrath of God to the whole human race is the sin of suppressing truth. Suppressing His truth. Now, what truth is being suppressed? That's a question we need to ask. Well, look down at verse 19. He tells us, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. See, the truth that every human being suppresses is the truth of God. They're suppressing what God reveals of Himself in nature to the whole human race. And this is not the truth of God that we learned from the Bible. This is actually, even though we would suppress that as well, but Paul is writing of a truth that's known about God apart from the Bible. A knowledge of God that makes God manifest. He says, that which is known about God is evident within them, for God has made it evident to them. Look at verse 20. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power, divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. They suppress the revelation about God that is revealed in the natural world. So again, you ask, when God reveals His wrath, how is it manifested? How is it revealed when people do this? Well, it's revealed basically by the words that you'll find in verse 24, verse 26, and verse 28. You see the same phrase used? 24, God gave them over. 26, God gave them over. 28, God gave them over. What is this? Divine abandonment. God's wrath in this passage is divine abandonment. You see that in that phrase, same exact phrase used in those three verses. So you can say in verse 24, that God gives men over to uncleanness. Verse 26, He gives men over to vile affections. And verse 28, He gives men over to a reprobate mind. He gives them up. If you want your sin bad enough, and you're unwilling to repent, and you reject God, you reject the gospel, He'll give you over to your own sin. He pulls back the restraints. and he lets you go headlong into it.